Hi, it's time for another What We Read episode, which you probably know because you clicked on this video.
It's a little on the nose.
Anyway, we're talking about more 2021 reads, specifically from January. And I'm gonna kick things off. My entire set of reads for this video, all 4 of them, are actually all historical romance reads. Wow. Because I participated in the last round of the historical romance readathon hosted by Jess, Lacey, and Lisa. I will link all of them down below. I love watching their videos and seeing their content, and they always inspire me to pick up more romance reads. Especially historical romance. So the first book I'm going to talk about is actually Night Song by Beverly Jenkins. I read this because it was the January book club pick for Historical Hellions, which is a book club run by Jess, same Jess, and Samantha from Books and Samantha. This is my second Beverly Jenkins book, and I'm looking forward to reading more of her work as well. This one is a standalone story. It is between a young teacher in a small town named Carolee Henson and a sergeant with the cavalry named Chase Jefferson. And so they have a chance encounter, sparks kind of fly, but they're both kind of hesitant to get involved with one another. Cara, because she doesn't want her reputation, you know, as an unmarried young school teacher to be marred. And Chase, because he doesn't really think of himself as the settling down type because he's in the cavalry, and that means he has to travel, like, all the time. But the sparks are a little undeniable between them, and eventually at some point they're gonna give in. There is a bit of drama that's thrown in towards the end of the story as well. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was fun. It kind of reminded me of all of the sort of like historical stories that I read when I was younger, like the Little House series and any of the American Girl series that I read. It just had the same vibe for some reason, and I like that it was more small town slice of life with this budding romance somewhere in the middle. I think that Beverly Jenkins captured that pretty well, like the atmosphere of a small town in the past and like all the things that come with that, whether it's your neighbors, you know, wanting the best for you or looking out for you, or, you know, the gossips in the town having a lot to say about your business, basically, whatever your business happens to be. The romance is also kind of cute because they were both super stubborn. Though it was clearly obvious that they liked each other, they were so stubborn about not being together until they finally gave in because they couldn't help themselves, and I was like, great.
Yeah, we know people like that.
I like that they were both strong-willed and independent individuals. I think that especially for Cara, that was a mark in her favor, because I always appreciate it when the heroine is like, she's like, I'm fine. Like, I can live my own life and handle my own thing by myself.
Meanwhile, the reader's like, sure.
I know, right? I did find it sometimes frustrating to see like their lack of communication. There was like a distinct amount of drama that ensued just because they didn't talk to each other properly, and I was like, come on guys, you just need to say something. And I also wasn't so fond of the big dramatic turns at the end of it. It still felt like it made sense with the story, but it just wasn't my particular cup of tea. But it was a really sweet romance. I thought it was really fun to read, and I'm looking forward to reading more from Beverly Jenkins. Cool. The second book that I read for the readathon was A Notorious Vow by Joanna Shupe. This is actually the book that they picked as the group read for the readathon. It was my first Joanna Shupe, and it's definitely not going to be my last. This one has Christina Barclays as the heroine. She and her family have sort of left England because they were in disgrace, and they, and by they I mean the entire family, needs her to marry wealthy so that they can sort of restore their good name and whatever. Except that her parents have their eye on this guy who is rich, but he's kind of intolerable, and by kind of I mean he's really terrible, and Christina doesn't want that, so she turns to her sort of reclusive neighbor Oliver for help, and they end up agreeing to have a platonic marriage for a year.
Platonic.
Except that, you know, obviously sparks fly between those two. This is a romance after all. I didn't know what to expect because I generally read mostly historical romance that's set in England or in the UK. Beverly Jenkins and Joanna Shupe are kind of a departure for me because they're both set in the United States. And Notorious Vow is specifically set in New York. And you know what? It was a whole lot of fun. I really like how refreshing the relationship between Christina and Oliver was. They had their fair share of miscommunications and misunderstandings, but the way they resolved it was pretty quick because they end up communicating. And I'm like, that's so refreshing to read in historical romance. It's also interesting because Oliver is actually deaf in the story. Oh. And so he is kind of being shunned by, you know, other privileged people because they think that him being deaf or having to, like, you know, use sign or read lips just makes him like dumb, you know, or like incapable of handling his own self, which is totally not true. There's that whole aspect, and the fact that he is actually trying to work on an invention that's sort of like a hearing aid to help people who have similar, like, you know,
even better.
problems as him. He was just such a great hero to read about. So I really enjoyed like watching them fall in love. They really start off as being like strangers and then friends, and then they fall in love with each other, which is great. I will say that the drama at the end is a little bit like, whoa, because it felt sort of like those kind of animated cartoon villains that tie the heroine to the train tracks and they're like, the speeding train is coming and the hero has to come save her. It kind of felt like that because the villain is not, like, it was kind of predictable who the villain was gonna be, but it was also kind of like, so we didn't really need that, but okay. Like, we had to take care of that problem. It did take away from what was such a great start to the story because it happens towards the end of it, and I was like, could have just avoided this entire set of shenanigans. But, you know, on the whole, A Notorious Vow was so much fun to devour. There were a lot of great moments between the hero and the heroine, and I liked both of them as individuals and together, so definitely enjoyed that book, and I'm looking forward to reading more of Joanna Shupe's work.
Alright, so a couple of rereads, but before we get to that, Servant of Bones by Anne Rice.
Oh.
Servant of Bones is, I think it's a standalone. I mean, Anne Rice has such a huge and long, illustrious career. It was nice to sort of deviate from vampires a little bit, and witches, and she sort of digs a little bit into sort of like Babylonian-ish sort of lore, because this is the Servant of Bones, does start out their life in Babylon, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, anyway, it's one of those ancient, like, clearly my opinions. I've been wanting to read Servant of Bones for a while because it's an Anne Rice book. Only because I have read like sort of like the Vampire Chronicles. Yeah. I've read more on Anne Rice in just a bit. But Servant of Bones does have a lot of her lush... And by the way, for full disclosure, this is the graphic novel version, which I think paints a totally different picture. I love when graphic novels are of a book are done well. Obviously I wouldn't know because I have not read the actual sort of like Servant of Bones novel. Novel. It's pretty long. It has Anne Rice's sort of like lush, far reaching, you know, centuries long type of storytelling brand, I want to say. There's a lot of that richness, that depth, that sort of existential crisis of, well, what am I really? And the Servant of Bones centers around a particularly gifted Jew living in, you know, captive Babylonian sort of like times, and he's, you know, he has ties to sort of like the local sort of Babylonian gods that he doesn't necessarily have with the, you know, the one god of Israel. So when that particular god sort of like sets him on a path, he's sort of tricked into being the Servant of Bones, which is sort of kind of like how you make a genie. And the Servant of Bones will be summoned over time to either do the bidding of, you know, the summoner, should he find the summoner worthy, or to just outright kill whoever decides to, you know, I mean, he's just, it's like, call the number at your own risk. And when the dude shows up, he's like...
Sorry, that's a funny way.
He's either gonna go, all right, what do you want? Or, nah, and just, you know, what I... So he's that's like, just...
out!
It's... And so he's like served Alexander the Great, and he's been all over the world until something beckons him to the present, which is always a kind of an Anne Rice thing. Like, she loves to, and that's, by the way, the linchpin, is these, you know, these immortals with their lives sprawling across the centuries, in this case the millennia, you know, being anchored to the present by something pressing is classic Anne Rice, I think, and I believe the graphic novel sort of captured that, notwithstanding that it has, I think, a foreword from Anne Rice herself as an endorsement means she was pretty happy about it, which I did not find said foreword or any kind of endorsement from Anne Rice for Claudia's story, which is another graphic novel set in the Anne Rice verse. Claudia's story focuses on the tiny little vampire child from Interview with the Vampire, who, well, vampire child body anyway. I mean, that was her biggest piece of angst, is decades later she's like, I'm not growing up, am I? And then she sort of realizes, and Louis is the first one to realize, by the way, the Vampire Chronicles centers first on a character named Louis de Pontefract. He is kind of like a French Creole type noble in sort of like New Orleans, who gets turned into a vampire by a very charismatic, very egomaniacal, very like Tom Cruise. There's watch the movie, you'll know what I mean, because only Tom Cruise can really pull off. I mean, Stuart Townsend tried, and it's not, that wasn't Lestat.
Gotcha.
It was an Elseworld alternate universe Lestat in the universe where Aaliyah would be the Queen of the Damned, Akasha, and who was interestingly enough a little more convincing as Akasha than Stuart Townsend was as Lestat. Anyway, point is, in the Vampire Chronicles stories, after Louis is turned by Lestat, you know, Louis just sort of was on the verge of sort of losing. He doesn't want to kill anyone. Like, that wasn't part of the deal. He was just, you know, dead inside, and now he was dead everywhere else too. So to sort of stave that off, Lestat finds an opening when Louis, unfortunately, just while he was wandering the streets looking for rats and, you know, whatever to kill, finds a little girl whose mother has died of the plague, and she still thinks her mom's, you know, like gonna make it, but clearly not. That's how young this child is. She's, like, in the book she's like 4. In the graphic novels it looks like she's at least 7. Kirsten Dunst was clearly in her like tweens when she did the film, just because it's just really weird to have like a 5-year-old vampire lover. Louis drains the girl, Lestat sort of like turns her, and in the end she grows up, and that's sort of like her deal. Is like she realizes that her 2 vampire dads aren't what she thought they were. The lack of enthusiasm on my part is mostly because I'm having such a hard time selling this thing without. And I love it. That's the problem. I love it. But at the same time, I'm like, how do I make people think this is cool when even I'm like, objectively speaking, this is pretty sketch? Because because, you know, problematic thing number 1, eventually she has the mind of not even an adult human, but of an adult sentient creature who has lived for almost a century and change. And yet the body of a 5-year-old and all of the sensibilities that lean feminine. So she's a little obsessed with, like, why don't I look like her? And they're like, eh. And Lestat buys her 755th doll, and she's like, I don't know. And Lestat's like, I thought you would like it. And Louis' like, dude, she's a woman now, technically. Without spoiling the events too much, because Claudia and Louis' stories diverge. That's a good way to sort of... And obviously Claudia's story is told from the moment she's turned all the way to the point of divergence from Claudia's perspective, drawn beautifully. It's so gorgeous and therefore disturbing because, you know, Louis and Claudia, thank goodness they didn't animate. I don't think they drew the kiss. If they did, then oh well. There's always Brad Pitt and Kirsten Dunst. There's interviews about how both of them were like, it wasn't easy for either of us. So, but there's that. So that was a reread. If that makes sense at all. But the best reread, sort of, anybody watching WandaVision out there? Me. Because we love that so much. The entire world is just like, this is awesome. I decided to reread House of M because there are disturbingly similar patterns that you will find in MCU Wanda and Marvel 616 Wanda, who decided to, well, under duress and praying mental stability, say a few things that changed everything. So House of M centers around Wanda Maximoff and her rapidly fraying sanity and its effects on her reality warping powers. Yeah. So in fact the whole House of M arc starts with the Avengers and the X-Men sitting down in a room. So there's a really awesome shot of everyone, including Charles Xavier, and the X-Men show up to this party at Avengers Tower. And they're like, whoa, why is everyone here? And they're like, we have to talk about what to do about Wanda Maximoff. Because she could obliterate reality if we don't do anything about that. And so everyone's talking about, do we put her down? And Captain America is like, she's an Avenger. We don't do that to our own. And then the X-Men are like, yeah, but... And really that's just Wolverine going, yeah, but... Because it's Wolverine. I mean, Wolverine was the guy who shanks Jean Grey every chance that he can get, assuming that even takes, just because it's the right thing to do when one of your... So the mutants sort of have a little bit of, we know when one of us go nuclear. And then Emma Frost being sort of like headmistress now, it's like, do you have any idea how it's gonna impact all the mutants around the world where we're already hated if the Scarlet Witch is found to be this kind of unstable? Look at what you're putting the community through. So they try to go over to Genosha and do something about Wanda, and what do you know? She decides to go, no, that's an illusion. And suddenly the entire world is a world where mutants rule supreme, and humans are the ones that are sort of like the underdogs, and the whole world is ruled by Magneto and the House of M. It is some of the most disturbing things I've watched and read in a while. It is wildly insane and crazy. And Wanda was lucid the entire time to a point. Just read it. Like, if you want a story that sort of was so pivotal to the entire Marvel sort of universe as we know it, where it straddles sort of both the Avenging side of things and the X-Men side of things, it triggers such insane ramifications. But
Okay.
technically mostly for the X-Men, because the way this book ends, oh boy, the X-Men just cannot catch a break. But those
When
days,
have they ever, though?
I would like to say those days are done, but we're in an X of Swords now, and I'm just like, for heaven's sakes, you guys. Anyway, back to you.
All right, back to historical romance land. The next book I'm going to talk about is also the first book I've ever read by this author. It is a book called The Highwayman, and it is by Kerrigan Byrne. So this premise, I'm just going to read you the summary that I made for myself for the blog. I said, it is a complicated romance between Dorian Blackwell, a ruthless, wealthy, and influential man that will stop at nothing to seek revenge and get what he wants, and Farrah Leigh Mackenzie, a beautiful widow who is keeping a powerful secret that could threaten her life. So Farrah and Dorian end up agreeing to a marriage because he agrees to protect her in exchange for the secret so that he can enact the revenge he wants. But it turns out there might be more that ties them together that they just don't know yet. And also that Farrah might just be the person to remind Dorian that underneath his sort of villainous persona, he actually has a heart. So at the beginning of the story, I wasn't sure if I was gonna like it, I'll be honest, because there was a part of me that was kind of like, it was okay, but it wasn't as, like, it didn't draw me in quite as quickly as some of the other historical romances I read. That being said, Kerrigan Byrne's writing is so convincing and so fluid that eventually I was just swept up into the series of events that was occurring and just needed to know, like, how was she gonna end this? Because I couldn't see a good way for it to end for them just because of the way they're both positioned in society and, you know, butting heads with each other, obviously.
Right.
But I did end up enjoying the cast of characters that we spend time with. I thought that the action and the mystery were kind of a fun element too, since I don't read a lot of historicals these days that have sort of these high stakes, really. I also like that there was a lot of angst in it, because that's always fun if you're in the right mood for it. But there was also a lot of heart and humor too. So I ended up thinking that The Highwayman was a pretty good start to the series. I'm actually curious to read the rest of it, because there's a particular secondary character that I really hope gets his own book. But all in all, it was a good introduction to Kerrigan Byrne, and I am interested in checking out her other stuff.
Cool.
The last book I'm going to mention is Bringing Down the Duke by Evie Dunmore. This is a romance that came out, I want to say 2 years ago now, and I'm only just getting around to reading it, which is terrible. So our heroine, her name is Annabelle Archer, and she has just won herself a scholarship to study at the University of Oxford. The condition is that she has to help by volunteering to get more people to support the women's suffragist movement.
Okay.
And this includes her trying to recruit powerful men like the Duke of Montgomery, aka Sebastian Devereux, who is one of the Queen's most prized strategists and tacticians. And these two meet in an unlikely way, and whenever they encounter each other, it's clear that there's sparks flying between them, but will their different statuses and goals in life prevent them from being together? Remains to be seen. I immediately liked Annabelle right off the bat, just because I liked the way that she was so clever about getting what she wanted and willing to sacrifice what she had to in order to keep it. I like that she was pretty independent, even though there was also, like, underneath she had a lot of vulnerability that she was keeping to herself and trying to manage herself. And I like seeing Sebastian go from, like, this stoic sort of cold character into someone who is also equally vulnerable but in a different way. And watching them develop a relationship was a lot of fun, even though there were definitely moments with angst in it, and I really liked that too. I also enjoyed the fact that Annabelle is part of the women's suffragist movement, like I mentioned, and that she makes some great friends. I'm eager to see more of their stories, which are supposedly the next couple of books in the series, which is very exciting. I thought it was really lovely just watching their relationship blossom and seeing how it all ends. And I honestly just soaked up every second I was reading this book, so I can recommend checking it out if you are interested in reading historical romance.
There you go.
And with that, we are at the end of this What We Read video. We hope you enjoyed it. If you have any thoughts on any of the books or comics mentioned in this video, please leave them down below. If you're watching WandaVision, you can also let us know, because we are really into that right now.
That's so great. It's such good TV.
It really is. And with that, we'll see you guys with another video soon.
Bye.
Bye.